So instructions, pretty useful. Usually at this event, this is my 9th time out of 10, so I've been here a lot. Usually we do it in the morning. I usually have to wake people up, so I have these sound effects. But today they kind of pale in comparison to the Queen thing. So what I want to talk to all of you about is the mobile opportunity that we have today, which I often talk about. But because the theme this time around is user-centered design, I want to look at how are we doing delivering on a user-centric experience to this giant opportunity that we have in front of us. I often like to say mobile is this planet-scale opportunity. And to kind of summarize really quickly what I mean by that, if you look at planet Earth, which is pretty much the only place we know of life in the universe or multiverse or whatever philosophy you ascribe to, the kind of life that we have here that we consider the most intelligent is us, human beings. And there's basically 7.7 billion of us on the planet. Now, when we talk about opportunity for things like mobile and software and the internet and the web, not all 7.7 billion people on the planet can we reach with this stuff, right? Some people are too young, some people are too old, other people have other things that kind of require us to slice this number some way. Now, I slice it by the people who are 14 and above and call that an addressable market. It's imperfect, but we can't hit all 7.7 billion. So this is a pretty good way of looking at how many people we could possibly reach. Now, of the 7.7 billion people on the planet, about 5 billion are mobile subscribers. That means they either have a voice or a data plan. Some are on feature phones, but an increasingly large number are on smartphones. In fact, right now, there's 4 billion active smartphones on the planet. About 75% of those are Android, 25% of those are iOS. They have varying capabilities, they have varying features, but pretty much unanimously, they have a couple things in common, right? Effectively, they're as powerful as the personal computers we had in the past. They're pocket-sized. That means you can bring them with us anywhere and everywhere. And they're always connected to this global internet. And 4 billion of these things active is just an amazing achievement, right? And an amazing opportunity. Clearly a planet-scale kind of thing. So when these 4 billion pocket-sized supercomputers visit the vast network of information that we've developed over the past 30 years, what kind of experience are they getting? Right? You fire up one of these supercomputers you have in your pocket, you're connected to the network, you access a website, and there's a high degree of likelihood that you're going to get a newsletter sign-up dialog. If you don't get one of those, you perhaps might get a confusing cookie compliance consent dialog. If you don't find a confounding cookie compliance dialog, you may get an app interstitial dialog. I'm going to put asking in quotes, for you to get the native app. Or you might be lucky and get 3 app download prompts. Or how about 2 app download prompts with a cookie consent dialog and account sign-in prompt? Or maybe one of each of those with a fixed position ad thrown in on top of that. Now some of you say, oh, this is just, newspaper publisher sites and publishing has fallen apart, so other sites don't do this, right? You wouldn't find this kind of thing on an e-commerce site, would you? Oh, this is just a problem in the US. Is there even any content on this, by the way? It's just this like white box is the only thing I could consider content. And then The Guardian chose a different approach. I don't think they did, actually. So while we all probably dislike encountering web pages like this, right? Does anybody think this is great? No, none of us really like this. Does anybody think this is common? Yes. OK. So why are we doing this? Pretty much everybody says this is bad. Pretty much everybody says this is common. So it must work. These techniques have to be effective. That's why everybody's doing them. That's why all of the websites we encounter look like this and act like this. These techniques work. Well, let's look at one of these things. Let's just look at app install ads first. All right, and there's a couple in those examples. You encounter all kinds of these things online. They take different shapes, forms, sizes, colors, amounts of presence. Right? And we can ask, are these things effective? And how effective are they? Of course, it matters really what we mean by effective and what we measure. Because it turns out, if you put a full screen interstitial, like a blocking page in front of people as they're trying to access a website, with a giant button in front of it, some percentage of people will click that giant button. In fact, in this case, when Google did this, and there's a published study on this online, about 9% of people hit the get the app button. That's a pretty good conversion, right? 9% of people clicking the button. This is great, right? But some percentage of those users maybe already have the app. Maybe they don't even follow through on getting that app. That's been notoriously a little hard to track, right? That full funnel. And so what we actually did was we said, OK, well, that's interesting. But what if we remove the interstitial screen? What happens? And the reason why we asked this was because we noticed that actually 70% of all the visits were abandoning. And it's interesting how quickly the scenario changes when you look at a different metric, right? When we just look at the percent of people clicking the button, 9% conversion, that's great. When you look at 70% of people bailing and doing nothing, it doesn't look so good anymore, right? And removing this app interstitial actually boosted one-day active users on the mobile web by 17%. What's the last A/B test you did that boosted daily active users by 17%? Probably most of us can't think of one, right? That's some pretty big impact. And native app installs, yeah, they fell 2%, but the trade-off was definitely worth it. And if you ask most people, what would you rather have? An increase in clicks on a button or a big increase in the amount of daily active users on your service, it's pretty clear which one they'd choose. Most of them would choose the daily active users. So if you start measuring active users instead of button clicks, what's good quickly changes. Now here's another example. When we actually observe people using sites, we learn other things too. So this is an e-commerce site. This is Sephora, and you can see they have a promo to go and get the app, right? And this person has actually found a product that they want to purchase, this Bobbi Brown lip gloss, because it's sensational. And let's watch what happens. So she's picked the color, and she's looking for an add to cart button. She doesn't see it, so maybe I need to pick this free shipping and then it'll show up. No, maybe it's down here. Okay, it doesn't look like it's down there. Okay. Maybe it's, could it be like over here? Maybe it's hidden in the you may also like area, right? So let's just kind of look around there. Okay, that stopped scrolling. Maybe it's at the beginning of it? No. Okay, so that's, is it at the top maybe? No. Yeah. It's the last day to shop, but how do I buy this? Maybe it showed up down here again. No, maybe I missed it. No, not there. Okay, what if I hit shopping cart? Maybe it's already in my shopping cart. No, there's nothing in my shopping cart. Okay, it's empty. So, really want to buy that lip gloss. Checkout button's gray. Okay, now I'm going to go back. Oh, man. How do I buy this lip gloss? You can see the frustration based on her finger movements. Finally, she closes the app install ad, and there it is. We laugh. It's the web. 53% of sites that were tested in the study that found issues like this had these add to app or these install app promos. Here's another one over on Under Armour. This is a kind of like athletic wear brand. And I won't mention the fact that you can't even see a product in the product filtering area, but let's assume you can, and people kind of want to filter it down. Right? So you go to filters, and you're trying to figure out, like, how do I filter this by categories, right? So you're kind of poking around, you hit maybe size and fit, and it says you must select a gender or category. But how do I select a category? I don't see category anywhere. I don't see gender anywhere. I can't even do the instructions that you have. And by now, you know the secret answer. You have to remove the app install ad. And there's the ability to filter by gender and category. Over here on overstock.com, I'm thinking about buying this tool. So I zoom in to view it a little bit closely, and now I'm stuck. What do I do? Again, you know the secret code by now. You close the app install ad, and now you can actually make your way through the gallery and run away. Right? So in this round of testing, if you ask most e-commerce company what metrics do they care about, likely sales conversion is pretty high on the list, right? And pretty consistently, a lot of these implementations of these install app banners were the direct and or only cause of abandoning when people wanted to buy something. Right, so having this kind of user experience that negatively affects critical metrics like this seems like a pretty big deal, don't you think? If you're an e-commerce company and you're actively blocking people from buying things on your site, doesn't seem good. So it's worth asking, how do we end up with issues like this? How does this happen? And you might first think, oh, it's perhaps a user experience design problem, right? Maybe these companies aren't investing in user experience design. And I thought that too, and so I just did a quick job listing search, and I found job listings for Under Armour, Overstock, and Sephora. Maybe they can't fill these job listings, but I assume that they have user experience design teams, right? And pretty much all of them, if you read through these things, there's this very flowery language just filled with superlatives about how design is so important. This is from Sephora, right? Like we want you to lead a client-centered design approach to develop the most innovative and usable digital experiences. You will define and advocate intuitive UX across our whole suite of stuff. Didn't feel that intuitive to me. Maybe innovative. So there's this disconnect, right? All these companies here are practicing user-centered design, but like you, I don't find these web experiences to be very user-centric at all. In fact, I find them very often, and increasingly often, which is why we're talking about this, to be user hostile, to be flat out anti-user centric, right? So what's going on? Why is this happening? It's not because there aren't user experience teams in these companies. And it's not just these companies. I don't want to single out anybody. You don't really have to look very far to find stuff like this. In fact, just follow a link, and you'll get to these kinds of experiences today. And so I talked to a bunch of people like, why is this going on? What's happening? And because I travel in user experience design and designer type circles a lot, I'll often talk to the design teams. And what I hear from the design teams is, well, PM made me do it. That's marketing. I didn't do that. I would never do that, but the marketing team did it. Business team does that. I just designed the user experience. I don't have anything to do with the stuff that's actually on the screen that people see that breaks the user experience. Is that clear? Does that make sense? Right? User experience designer. So I hear this business goals are outweighing design goals. But as we saw with these app install banners, and I can point you to similar type of data about all the other stuff, important business metrics like daily active users, e-commerce conversions, they're actually taking a hit with these approaches. We're negatively impacting business outcomes and then blaming business goals. So to answer this question of what's going on and how does this happen, I want to go back in time a bit to the Rhode Island School of Design. It's quite a famous design school, perhaps the design school most people think of when they think about design schools in the US. And if you've ever taken a design class like the ones at the Rhode Island School of Design, you've probably experienced what's known as a design critique. Design critique is when in any design class, you kind of get the opportunity to go over the work people have done on a project or on a semester or whatever and talk about the choices they made. You get feedback and you talk about ways to improve it. When I was in design school, this was many years ago, things weren't as nice as that. I had this one professor whose first thing he would do is just walk up, grab somebody's project and throw it in the trash to kick off design reviews. So they could be a little nasty. But regardless, the thing that most of them have in common is they're really long and they take place in design studios. And in design studios, when you've got the whole class in there looking at stuff, most people are sitting on the ground or they're sitting on these really uncomfortable stools, these metal stools that exist in these rooms. And at the Rhode Island School of Design, one student sort of noticed the fact that people were sitting for 8 hours at a time on these hardwood floors, and frankly, their butts hurt. All right, so that's him over there in the corner. You can't see him because there isn't actually a picture of him. But that's Joe Gabaya. And he experienced this pain firsthand. He was a student at the RISD, and he went to many of these design reviews, and at the end of them, his butt hurt. So he wanted to try and fix this. And he came up with a cushion. He named it Crit Buns for preserving your buns during a critique. And the way they work is you kind of sit on them, and your butt doesn't hurt after a long day in a design studio. Right? Many people were skeptical of the solution. He finally sold 200 units to the MoMA in New York, and then it got featured at a Tokyo Design Show, and now demand is pretty good. But the key point to this story is Joe was able to build a very user-centric product that addressed literally real pain points because he had an intimate knowledge of that problem, right? He was not only the person making the product, but he was also the end user of that product. Like his classmates, his butt also hurt. Later, when Joe was in San Francisco, he was kind of encouraged by the success of Crit Buns to start another project. He convinced his old classmate, Brian Chesky, to move up to SF to work with him on what's next. But San Francisco has very high rents. The two needed some money. So Joe sent Brian an email outlining a little plan by which they could make some extra money during a design conference. And basically they said, hey, why don't we turn our apartment, which is near this design conference, into a little bed and breakfast. We have an air mattress, so we'll call it Air Bed and Breakfast. We'll charge people a couple bucks. We'll make them breakfast. They'll go to the conference, and they'll have this local experience, and we'll make some extra cash. So they launched this website called Air Bed and Breakfast. Right? You can see it's for the IDSA design conference attendees. They ended up getting 3 guests. Each guest made them $80. They hosted them. They made them breakfast. And it went pretty well. And after that first weekend, they started to get some emails from other people around the world asking when their site would be available for other destinations, like Buenos Aires, London, and Japan. And Airbnb, which I'm sure you all know, was born. Today, 2 million guests a night go to Airbnb listings. And so Joe and Brian weren't the only ones that have this problem that they tried to solve. But we see the same pattern that Joe had when he did Crit Buns, which is Joe and Brian needed money. Joe and Brian had an apartment. They hosted people. They made room for them. They made some money, right? And when the user is the maker, there's no gap between who is building the product and who is using it. So user-centered design, again, super easy, right? Super easy when you're the user. But as a company grows, gaps start forming. So Joe and Brian, when they wanted to upgrade that Air Bed and Breakfast website, they called on their old roommate Nathan, who was a developer, to help them build the next version. Nathan hadn't hosted any guests. He didn't experience that problem. He didn't have this intimate knowledge. So Joe and Brian have to kind of explain to him how to make the service the way it is. And we don't just have development teams in our companies. We also may hire some designers, to make some mock-ups along the developers that ship the code. And as the company grows, we probably have some product managers. They need to coordinate the work of the developers and the designers. They need to appropriately consider market dynamics, timelines, all that stuff, right? And then the functions continue to expand and grow. Maybe we need a legal department, a security team, a growth team, a privacy team. A whole bunch of things start rolling in. And as these teams grow and grow, we start to create more and more distance between decision-making and the actual customers. The parts of the company that are the ones closest to the customers, if there are any at all anymore, aren't the ones making the decisions. And leadership at the top is focused on a whole bunch of other stuff. They have to keep these organizations functioning, and they have to rearrange the organizations, obviously, right? Reorgs, that's kind of what we do. They're focused on things like brand perception, portfolio management, shareholders, right? A whole bunch of things on their plate. And so this growth begins to create this gap, which I will call the company-customer gap, or the distance between the organization and the end user. Because there's all these things between leadership and the customer, it makes it very difficult for them to have awareness. And insights are very difficult to come by. If you've ever played the game of telephone, have you ever played that, where one person says something to the next person? Now imagine playing that game where each person in the line is highly incented to change the meaning. And I say highly incented to change the meaning is because, consciously or not, all these different groups recontextualize the message in their own viewpoint, right? So when you say a certain thing, the legal department hears something totally different than the design department hears, even though you said the same thing. And so by the time messages get to leadership, all sorts of political agendas, consciously or not, right? Resourcing agendas, what have you, start to trickle in. And it becomes very difficult for folks over here to be able to act in the interests of people over here. And you can see this, these gradually competing agendas and perspectives start creeping into the products we make. This customer-company gap shows up in product designs very, very quickly. So imagine we want to put up a form for allowing people to contact us, right? The user experience requirements are pretty clear. Okay, who are you? How do we get back to you? We don't really care. Email, phone, whatever works for you. And tell us what you want to tell us. And then some sort of affordance to send the message. Right? Pretty straightforward. Contact us. Sales teams hears about this and they're like, whoa, we're talking to leads. If they're leads, right, we need a phone number, an address, so we can send them stuff, and we need to have a subject by which they're contacting us so we can route them to the appropriate team in the sales department. Engineering's like, hold on. You can't collect address like that. You know, in the database, we actually store names as first name, second name, so you have to have two fields for that name value pair. And by the way, address, you have to have, street address, regular number, city, zip code, and okay, now we can actually build it. We couldn't build it the other way. We have to build it this way. So marketing hears about this, and they're like, woohoo, a way to capture demographic information. Let's make sure we ask people, their gender, their date of birth, and of course we want to allow them to opt into any and all marketing preferences that we may happen to have set. Somebody from the legal department's like, whoa, you're asking for all that information? All right, we have to have a terms of service and a privacy policy, and people have to accept that and check it and what have you. And you can see how it quickly escalates. And this is not a new phenomenon. In fact, it was articulated quite a long time ago in 1967 by Melvin Conway. There's this thing called Conway's Law, which basically says organizations produce designs that are copies of the organizations. Right? And you can, in many cases, smell it on our products. You can come back, yeah, that's legal. Right? Or, yeah, that's marketing. A simpler way of putting this is everybody ships their org chart. Everybody. And so as organizations grow, decision-making moves further from end users, and the structure of the organization starts to show up in our product designs. Our org charts become evident in the user-centered experiences we're making, right? They're no longer that user-centered anymore. And that's a problem in and of itself, but it starts to lead to additional problems as well, which is a nice intro to gap number 2. So, what is this? What do you do on a chair? Sit on it. What it is and why it exists, pretty closely matched, right? Very small leap. You see it, you know what it's for, it's sitting. There's a very little gap between the form and its function. The design of the product immediately fills in that gap between what it is and what it's for. So the purpose of the product tightly aligns with its final form. It's intended to be sat in, its intention is clear, or another way to put this is the purpose and value is clear in the design, right? So let's look at another product experience, mostly because it's fashionable and kind of popular right now. Scooter sharing. You've all heard of this scooter sharing stuff, right? So let's say you come up to a scooter like this in your town, because it's on the street, and you want to ride it somewhere. What's that experience like? Well, it starts pretty typically. You've got to get your phone, you've got to get the app, and then once you get the app, you get a splash screen. And then you get a tutorial. This is a smart bike share. You can park anywhere, and all you have to do to get going is just scan to ride. But that's not really true, because you also have to give us your email address and pick a password. And you also have to give us permissions to access your location. And by the way, did we mention permissions? Because we also want you to agree and consent to our terms of service, our privacy policy, and our user agreement. Once you do all those things, then we're going to ask you permission to use your camera so you can scan the thing like we promised you. But you need to load up an account. And after a couple steps of loading the account, we're going to give you a whole tutorial on where you can or can't park it, because earlier we told you you can park it anywhere. And that tutorial is actually going to be longer than the original tutorial. And then we're going to ask you for some more permissions, and then we're going to finally let you go and ride a bike or a scooter. So there's reasons for each of these things to exist in design, but is the end result really user-centric? Right? When you add them all up as a full experience, you walk up to a scooter on the street and you want to go ride. Is this great? Doesn't seem like it, right? I would actually characterize it as pretty darn painful. So let's see some of these reasons why these things are in here, and then how are those things adding up to this second gap that I was just talking about a second ago. So we'll switch over to another scooter sharing service for a minute here, and just to keep things consistent, right? So this is a Hello Bike, and again, you get splash screen, you get sign up screen, and then you get terms and conditions that you actually have to scroll in complete format, making sure you don't miss any important, legally binding contractual agreements. Most people would agree that 15 screens of legal copy is not the most user-centric experience, right? Even if we make the case that people benefit from this, we're disclosing important information for them, who the heck can read that and understand what it means? Like, they don't even call it Hello Bike in the copy. It's called like X Bike. And I'm not even going to try reading it. But this format probably isn't the best way to let people know what they're signing up for, even if your intentions are good. And so I talk to teams and I say, well, why are you doing this? And again, I hear something like, well, legal made me do it. I wouldn't do that. Again, I'm just in charge of the user experience. This doesn't have anything to do with that. And so this may seem like a valid reason. We have to show these terms in service. It starts opening up this gap between what something is and why it exists, right? Instead of the form of a product reflecting its purpose and its value, it starts to reflect something else. In this case, it starts to reflect these organizational requirements, which come from siloed different parts of the company. And they all have different perspectives, different views of the world, right? And so the product experience isn't actually what benefits the customer, but instead what PM, legal, business, et cetera, made me do. In other words, to put this more simply, we start doing things for reasons other than our customers. Let's look at another one of these reasons. And again, we'll go to another scooter sharing company, bike sharing company, because there's just so darn many of them these days. This is OFO. They have a start screen. They got a bunch of permission screens. And then they have a tutorial, right? And these tutorials in here are often very justified by people saying, well, everybody's got one of these. That's why we did it. Everybody else is doing it. Well, what does that mean, everybody else is doing it? Well, it's common practice, if any of you have worked on a software design project, to kick things off with what's known as a competitive analysis. Right? You've heard of this, like you go and look at what all your competitors are doing, you print it out on the wall, you look at it, and you're like, oh, they're doing that, everybody's doing this, right? You compare and contrast all the stuff that you see, and you put it up on a wall. It looks something like this. In the case of scooter sharing companies, we can look at the onboarding experience of companies like Spin, OFO, Bird, Jump, Lime. And when we print all these things out, look at them on the wall, we're like, ooh, they have an intro tour, and they have an intro tour, and they have an intro tour, and they have an intro tour. Probably a good idea, right? Everybody's got one. So they must be good. Everybody's got one. So we're going to skip doing any kind of testing, because probably all the other companies did it, which is in itself an interesting statement. You're saying you're going to skip it because you assume everybody else did it, but didn't they also do the same thing? Anyway. So we start adding these things. But let's see what happens when you actually check some of this stuff. So Vevo is a music video service that, of course, has an intro tour. And when they looked into how people were using this through a combination of user testing and analytics, they found most people just swiped through the thing. They didn't read any of it. So they got rid of it, and they got more people signing in, and they got more new customers coming in, right? And this was from 160,000 participants over 28 days. Number of people who dove into the app increased, didn't really change engagement or retention, so the tour wasn't doing anything, right? The new flow didn't turn people off, and it was all good. And you can see similar practices at work in the evolution of several Google products too. Google Photos, for instance, used to have splash screen, intro screen, a tutorial. And in the Android app, that got dropped, that got dropped, that got dropped, that got dropped through a bunch of studies and experiments. And this screen in the middle kind of got rethought and designed to put a focus on getting your photos back up in sync. And the purpose of this here is to get people to the value of the product as quickly as possible. If you don't back up your photos, which Google Photos is good for, you can't get the ability to search your photos instantly and easily by faces or by objects. You can't get these auto-awesome photos that people make. So if we don't back up photos, none of the value in the product is there. And the goal of this is to get people to that value as quickly as possible. But surely other things our competitors are doing are required, right? Like sign-up forms. Of course, we've got to get people signed in to an account. Everybody's doing this because it's a good idea, right? Well, Hotel Tonight decided to challenge this because they, like Vevo, were watching people. And they noticed that accounts confused people. Their mental model for Hotel Tonight was not signing up for a service, but it was sort of like get in, get out. And when they dropped the sign-in requirement to book a hotel, they saw a pretty significant uplift in conversions, 15% increase in conversions. And it's not just Hotel Tonight that learns account signups are a barrier for people. It turns out the requirement of signup turns people off in a lot of cases, right? This is probably something you know, but you can regularly see conversion rates go up a substantial amount just through the introduction of a guest checkout flow. We saw this chart earlier in the conference where reasons for checkout abandonment from the Baymert Institute, 60% of people aren't ready to buy, they're just browsing. But the number 2 reason after that is the site wanted me to create an account, right? So what everybody's doing, just because everybody else is doing it, might not be such a good idea after all. And as we once again start to do things for reasons than our customers and insights that we glean from them, the gap between what our products are and what they exist for starts to grow again. Right? So now we're doing things because everybody else is doing it. It's a pattern. Competitive analysis shows it's widely used. But we don't directly know if this is good for our customers or not. We just know other people are doing it. But wait, there's more. Coming back to OFO's scooter sharing service, so many of these sharing services, right? So there's a sign up, phone verification, and then they give you this subscription promo. Now, you look at it and you're like, okay, start your free week with an OFO pass. Try it free. Doesn't really seem like there's anything else you can do here, right? So you hit try it free, but all of a sudden it's $25 and $49. So then you go back and it says try it free, and then you go back and it's $29 and $25. Turns out there actually is a way to get out of this. You have to hit that little back arrow, and if you hit the little back arrow, you end up at the map where you can actually unlock a scooter or bike and start driving it. Right. Now, what's going on? I have no insider information whatsoever, but I have a pretty strong suspicion that this was a well-performing A/B test. Right? And when we put up this design, lots of people hit the try it free button. More people hit the try it free button when we obscured every other possible action than the try it free button. So data shows this is what we launch, right? And now we say things like the data made me do it. It converts better. You've heard a lot of people talk about the importance of A/B testing today and how they can have an impact on conversion. But again, we need to think about what we're measuring, right? The classic example of the A/B test is the blue button versus the orange button. Oh yeah, more people click on the orange button. And when you see this sort of stuff, it's actually pretty compelling. Right? You can say, oh, okay, well, this is doing better than this, so we clearly want to do the one that outperformed the other one. We want to go implement that design. And we make a product design choice because of the data. And you may say, Luke, what's wrong with that, right? Isn't this how we improve user experiences, by testing and seeing how user experience improves? And of course we want to improve things, but it really matters how we measure and define improves, right? In most of these A/B tests, these metrics are driven by very specific actions and or business considerations, like OFO's signups, subscription signups. But the reality is many companies have results that look like that button color example, right? Ooh, this went up 9% here, 3% here, and we changed this copy, 5% there. And if all that stuff added up, your chart for business results should look like this. But it usually looks a lot more like this. So where did that 3% and that 9% and that 8% and that 7%, where did all that go? Right? In isolation, they show all these little short-term gains, but when we look at the longer-term impact, we see a very different story. And these long-term actual results just aren't the same. And one of the most common reasons behind this is that we're not really doing tests with a lot of contrast. We're doing things that really quickly can just fall back to the way things were before, right? And so if you look at something like the impact of a button color change, I would characterize this as pretty low contrast in terms of a test. Right? Okay, we made the button light green instead of dark green. A couple more people clicked on it. A more significant contrast would be, hey, this person's on an iPhone and they're a user of Apple Pay. Let's completely change the checkout flow by surfacing a native payment option as the default and hiding completely all the other options. As again, ooh, that sounds scary, that's risky, but pretty high contrast, right? Pretty big difference. And so why is this a pretty big difference? Because even if I change the color of this button, what happens after it doesn't change at all. Still got to go through this big, long, honking checkout form, right? Whereas, if you look at the higher contrast test, if I change this to a native payment option, then instead of that big, long checkout flow, I just get a look at the screen and double tap and you're done. So a pretty dramatic change to the purchasing experience. And these higher contrast things can actually get you more meaningful changes, right? You go from this multi-step form-based checkout experience to a single double tap with biometric authentication. That's a lot of differences. So a lot of this testing stuff, to make good use of testing, we should really test things that have a higher degree of riskiness, a higher degree of potential impact, right? And if you operate at a very, very large scale, then maybe some of these lower contrast things can help. But again, over time, right, they won't add up in the way that they do in isolation. So the longer term impact really needs to be strongly considered. The other way of using testing and or experimentation that I think is very responsible and useful is just sticking everything you roll out behind an experiment. So when you put it out there, you can kind of see how it's performing, make sure you're not breaking everything, look if everything's okay, right? If something's really wrong, then you can just turn off that experiment, no problem. So this sort of like defensible feature flagging aspect of experimentation is just good hygiene for product launches. So testing is not bad, right? That's not what I'm saying. But I think there's ways to use it very effectively to build good products. And then there's ways to potentially be misled by what it's telling you and end up with the product that has multiple, the data made me do it decisions that don't really add up to a very customer-centric experience in the end. Okay, back to scooter sharing. Anybody sick of this bike sharing stuff yet? Here's another way we make decisions for reasons other than customers. So again, your typical splash screen, intro screen, and then sign up, split across, enter name, enter email, enter phone, phone verification, right? And every single input field is split up. We use the light gray text that you can barely read for the input fields. Or why are we using that light gray text that you can barely read? Oh, because that's part of our design guidelines. That's how we do input fields. It's this light gray text and the input, and away you go. Right. And in an effort to scale the impact of design teams, many companies invest in these things called design systems, or common design components, front-end components that try to make it easy for teams across the company and beyond to build stuff. But pulling a few off-the-shelf design components from a library is not the same thing as creating a customer-centric user experience. For example, this is JetRadar. It's a flight search engine. And they, in fact, are using the material design input fields guideline for their input fields. They, in fact, are using the material design floating action button for their primary call to action in the site. But you don't have to be a UX expert to see this end result is not particularly great. I mean, do you even know what the heck to do here? Kind of. Not really. What looks like inputs is actually hidden, is the little inputs at the top. what to enter are actually just duplications of what they put in as hint text on the label field, but the hint text kind of looks like a default answer, right? And God only knows what to do with that orange arrow at the bottom right. Their most recent redesign is perhaps much more approachable to people, right? You can kind of look at it and figure out what it does and how. I could quibble with some of what they do here, but you get the idea, right? The point is simply applying a style guide or design components doesn't ensure your product works well. In fact, if you do it without thinking too much, it could have the opposite effect. And now, in fairness, material design has actually updated both of these guidelines I showed you earlier to cover some of these cases. But the point still stands. There's more to making a holistic user experience, and especially a very user-centric one, than applying guidelines. And even if you have a complete, elegant, and very thoughtful design system, like this is Audi's design system, it's got a whole bunch of content and information about how to bring the Audi brand to life, all sorts of UI guidelines, right? And I was like, oh, awesome. There's this great design system here. I'm going to go see what the website looks like. Did that design system really help make an awesome web experience? Now you say that's not the fault of the design system, but it's not helping either, right? By the way, side note, I always wonder, like, you go to these sites and you get to like take a survey about our website right when you enter, right? What are you going to say? Oh, I just got here, so it's pretty shitty right now, but maybe later, if you ask me again, maybe I'll have more of an opinion. And then they get back the feedback results. They're like, oh no, feedback's really low. We need to ask for more feedback. Send more surveys. And it's just this catastrophic loop. But back to design systems. How can I possibly say they're causing problems, right? Isn't design consistency a good thing? Shouldn't we try to make all our designs consistent? Well, these are pretty consistent. All right? So I don't think you can use consistency as your barometer for success. And while they have good aims, a lot of these things can quickly become reasons for doing something, for applying a specific solution, for the sake of something like consistency. And just because something's consistent doesn't mean it's necessarily good, right? Too often, why we do things like, oh, well, that's what the guidelines say. It's about consistency with guidelines versus consumer context and needs. And these decisions get worse when you don't have this deep understanding of the problem space and you're just applying off-the-shelf solutions to things. Right? Bottom line, it's yet another reason we do things that aren't aligned with what customers want. So whether it's design guidelines, testing results, competitive analysis, or some other rationale, the more product decisions that get made for reasons other than the end user, the more the gap between what something is and why it exists starts to expand, right? This original idea you have of what you're trying to achieve versus the implementation of it starts to grow. And to come back to scooter sharing for one last time, you can come to a scooter, and just based off of the hardware, you have a pretty clear sense of what to do with this thing, right? You kind of do this. So the gap between what it is and why it exists is pretty minimal. But with software, we really struggle to close this gap. So here's a quick way how we might be able to close it a little bit. To get people to the purpose and value of one of these sharing services sooner in software design, assume you see a scooter, you want to ride it. The instructions there point you to taking a picture with your camera of the QR code. And with that, what happens is you actually can get a little pop-up that says to open this thing up. You get a web page. That web page has a native payment solution built into it. It's got just sort of the key info you need to start writing it. You hit that, look at it, and double-click, and you're done. Now contrast this effectively much faster process, right? And by the way, this is all done with no native app whatsoever. No need to even download the native app, which is a whole nother step and a half, right? We just do this with the web and the existing camera app. And we can quibble about how achievable that design is and all that sorts of things, but what it really tries to do is bridge this gap between what it is and why it exists by getting you on that scooter as fast as possible, making you have the experience that shows you the purpose and value of this. And this contrast becomes really evident when you compare it to like all the other stuff that's out there. In fact, most of the examples that we looked at, they don't have that level of directness, right? There's like 15 million things we make people do just because that's the way we do it. Oh, gotta get the native app. You need the native app. Doesn't have to be that way. So when the gap between the customer and the company grows, decision-making moves further away from end users. People start to do things for reasons other than the customer, which makes what it is and what it's for pretty different. Right? Design teams do things because of design systems. Business teams do things because of competitive audits. Product managers do things because of A/B test results. And you may say, Luke, well, this seems like a really designy argument, this gap between what something is and why it exists, right? Isn't that just design nerderism? Why do we care about that? Well, we care because it creates this third and last gap, which really starts to affect the bottom line and your growth as a company. With a big gap between what something is and why it exists, it takes people a long and arduous time to get to its value, right? The process of getting to that value increases in length and difficulty, and that's where bottom line and growth takes a hit. So to illustrate, let's look at an example in e-commerce. By the way, I ended up on this one, Free People. Does anybody know Free People? I ended up on this one because it's listed as one of the top 10 e-commerce design sites on some list somewhere on the internet. And I believe everything I read on the internet. So here's one of the top 10 e-commerce designs. So I followed the link from that article, and when I arrived there, I actually only found two things. I found an app install banner and a newsletter promo that had taken over the entire screen. Not a great start, I would argue. So I did what most people did, and I dismissed that pop-up, and that revealed a few more things to me. That revealed to me this promotional banner, this icon-based navigation system, and a feature promo here. Now, I was really encouraged by what I did when I removed that giant sign up for a newsletter promo that revealed useful stuff. So I said, well, what happens if we get rid of this app install banner and this promotional banner for a minute? Well, what happened is all these categories popped up from underneath that feature, right? And I said, that's interesting. Maybe it doesn't seem all that interesting until you consider the impact of this UI. In a few tests, GrowthRock compared this sort of standard e-commerce page that we just saw a second ago, where they've got the carousel layout, and they tested it against putting a couple categories on there. And the end result was a 5% increase in completed orders. Now, again, not clicks on things, but actually in completed orders, which is a real metric we would care about. And there was evidence that suggested it was the category pages that drove that, because views of those category pages jumped like 10 to 12%. And then they tested it in another vertical. This one was kind of like a ice cream flavor dessert place. They again tested the promo thing versus exposing a couple categories, and it led to a similar jump in category page uses, but for them a huge increase in completed orders, because all of a sudden people knew that this company sells more than just the vanilla that was advertised, but a couple other flavors. Another example of the same thing, this comes from Google's mobile optimization efforts. Edgar's was this fashion retailer in South Africa. They dropped this animated banner. They put some high-level categories above the fold, put a value proposition up top, and they got a pretty big increase in revenue per visitor. So for these reasons, I say, hey, it's actually kind of interesting that when I got rid of some of these promos, something that can move metrics that we'd actually care about showed up on the page, right? These category links. That's probably a good thing. So it seems like getting these categories on the site to be more visible matters if we're tracking impactful metrics like sales. But there's more that we can do to get people to the value of this product and start closing this third gap, right? This journey between what something is and what value it gives me. So we can look next at this icon-based navigation system, which I always think like some future people or some alien people will look at this and try to interpret it as our language, right? Like this hieroglyphic symbol. I've been wanting to do this for a while, to like make a language of icons: menu, search, shopping cart, right? But when I say aliens, you don't have to go very far to find people who don't know what these symbols mean. And to illustrate this point, a lot of speakers have talked about the need to back up icons with other text, but like it's every icon, right? When Amazon launched in India, they found that even the search icon isn't as standard as we all think. People thought it was a ping pong paddle. I don't know why is the ping pong paddle there. So they had to put up a little pop-up and explain what's going on, right? So what we believe are standards and universal aren't necessarily. And we saw another example of that with the floppy disk earlier too. So we should clarify the search function a little bit. Instead of having that little icon there, I'm going to go ahead and change it to something like this, put in a search bar. And with critical functions like search, we just want to be really explicit in the product UI. Again, close the gap between what something is and why it exists. Also gives us a chance to call out popular items like search for bodysuits, cardigans, and more, which turns out that's what these people sell. And I call out search as critical because, again, exposing it by default, as you saw earlier in the conference, can also help with conversions. Here's another example of that from that same site. You don't have search folded out. You fold it out. You see a big increase in searches. And the number of people who have clear intent when they search is high. And so as a result, you impact conversion positively. This transition also happened on Google Photos. So Google Photos went from this floating action button that I mentioned earlier for search to a very similar solution to what we just dropped in on Free People, where there's a search box in the header and it says things like search for Christmas or other things that rotate in based on what's in a user's library. By the way, another example of simply applying a design component with too much thought could potentially lead you astray here, right? So now we have a pulled out search area. Now we have the category links exposed. How else can we make it easier for people to experience the value of this product? Well, again, I got really encouraged by just removing stuff. And so I thought, well, why don't I remove this, the new now thing? Because what the hell is that anyway? And when I did, something also interesting happened. Wow, the most popular products on the site showed up. I don't think the feature drives too much in the way of core metrics, but imagine actually showing products on an e-commerce site. Who would have thought of this? Genius, right? Like, what if we show the things we sell to people when they come to the website? No, forget that. We just got to have a giant newsletter sign up, okay? You're just crazy. But why don't we show some more? That's only 2. Let's throw some more in there. We can fit a couple more in there. And by the way, we can make this scroll left and right. People love to scroll stuff, and we'll put it in this like comfortable, nice, so you can just like flick with your thumb. It's like millennial day camp, right? You just go and flick through all these things, and life is good. And scroll they will. Pinterest found that even removing core features like the amount of pins and likes photos had and who posted them, when they got rid of all that stuff inside of their onboarding flow and just focused on the pictures, they were able to get more photos on screen, which increased the chances that people would find photos that they like and therefore continue to use Pinterest. So the likelihood they find things that are interesting to them helps drive the likelihood that they become a user, and it's the same principles here as well. We want to get more of that content on the screen, give people more of an opportunity to find what they like. Now, looking at this, it's a little odd that the category links are above the popular product, so maybe we want to sort of swap these two a little. I don't know, bit of a trade-off between scrolling through them and having the category links. But overall, regardless of which one of those things we do, I think we're making some progress on closing this gap between what something is and why it exists, right? If you remember where we started, it looked like this. And when you encounter something like this, the mental state that you get put into is like, oh, this kind of sucks, right? I don't know, I sort of want to get out of here. What is this? Versus the mental state that you get put into when you encounter something like this, hopefully is a little bit more like, ooh, my kind of thing. I get it. Ooh, I should look around here. Maybe I'll find something I like. But you may say, Luke, what about that? You dropped all those free shipping promos. Aren't those important? We heard from a few speakers that having that value proposition thing on all our pages is a good thing. Doesn't that help with conversion? Indeed, one of the top reasons for abandoning a shopping cart, as we saw before, after you get rid of the browsing, the number one thing is the extra costs are too high. So by the time I got to the shopping cart, it told me I have to pay all this money and I'm out of here. Free shipping can help motivate people to not enter that state, right? So it's a winner. People should know about it. I'm not against telling people you have promotions on shipping and those sorts of things, but I do contend that perhaps there's a better time and place for it than a giant pop-up when you first enter the screen. Perhaps on something like the product page, or perhaps on something like the checkout experience. Those perhaps might be better places to tell people when they're at that point in the journey where that stuff is actually likely to impact their decisions. The tricky but very valuable thing that makes mobile design quote unquote hard, because we're so limited on screen space, right, is finding the right time and place for things. When and where do we introduce people to the idea that they can get free shipping? Thinking through what the appropriate location, placement, and timing for some of these value propositions is critical to getting people to act on them. I really like to cite this example as an illustration of this principle. We often assume calls to action have to be up above the fold, and so that control of the big button up front is probably going to do better than this 20 times as long page. But it turns out actually that long page does much better in terms of converting people. And what I really like about this example more than anything else is their explanation of why. The issue isn't whether that call to action is visible. The issue is whether or not that call to action is visible when somebody needs it. When somebody's ready to take that action, once they've sort of been convinced to take that action, right? So again, it comes back to this when and where do we put things. The other improvement that we can make on these value propositions, especially the ones in the original design, is to think about how we actually fold them into the product design. I've shown a few of these examples before, but it's people's instinct to dismiss stuff that looks like it's not part of the UI, right? We have this almost caveman-like instinct to remove these tooltips and these pop-ups. Tanner from Facebook brings this up. People often instinctively dismiss them, even if the stuff that was in there was good for them, even if they needed it. And one of my favorite examples of this is from Red Laser, because at the heart of this problem is our desire to make things pop. That is, we think to ourselves, this is important. It needs to look important. It really needs to stand out, right? And so we make the UI really stand out. And what happens is people are like, oh, I'm going to ignore that. Doesn't look like the rest of this. Doesn't seem relevant. So Red Laser had this primary action of scanning things to find their prices. So they made it big and red and stuck in the bottom. And Miles says, oh, people totally ignored it. So then they did this, and then they did this, and guess what? People used it, right? And the way to summarize this is if things look foreign to the app UI, they get kind of dismissed, turned off. Whereas if things look integrated with it, then they're much more likely to get noticed and be considered as part of the information we're taking in as we act on these web pages, right? So with those two thoughts in mind, what is the right time and place for some of these free shipping promos, and what is the right way to surface them in the UI is how I would approach bringing those in. Okay, we can sit here and redesign free people all day, but I'll just add one more consideration that you're likely to hear. It's quite possible someone looking at this would say, but what about the brand, right? While I hope the brand comes through in the font choices, the colors, and the actual products, especially the products, when people say something like that, what about the brand? They mean something like this, right? Like we need some aspirational imagery that drives the personality of the company, serves as a hook for people to come in. After all, everybody wants the Mad Max look today, right? So how do we make that clear? And I agree, this design is looking a little bland. That's kind of why I pushed maybe the popular products to the front earlier. And maybe we can add some brand imagery, right? Here's a brand thing. That's what I'll call it, to bring back some soul. But even with this addition, I still think we retain some of the functional benefits we've been adding, right? The focus on the categories, the search bar, the popular products being there, visible. Now, and it's certainly doing a bit better than when we started, right? But adding things back in starts to become a bit of a dangerous game, right? Be mindful of the reasons why we're doing this. Are we adding the brand imagery because the brand department demands it? Or the marketing department thinks it's important? Or is it because it's actually helping the customer? All right, remember our first gap here. Is it the agenda of some department? Because if you start then getting back to those agendas, you're going to end up again with a product experience that mashes up the agenda of multiple teams, which is increasingly the norm out there. I focused a lot on free people, but they're certainly not alone. If you look at a bunch of other e-commerce sites, you see we're all doing the same stuff. Right? Maybe it's business teams doing things because of competitive analysis, probably likely, or product managers doing things because of A/B test results, probably likely, so on and so on. But all these things are being done not necessarily for the customer and what gets them to the value of your product. So the end result becomes this third gap. This gap between people's first-time experience and becoming a happy, satisfied customer. And because I used alliteration for the first two things, right, customer, company, I had to use it here. So I called it Fandom, even though it's not so great. Right? But if there's a big gap between what something is and why it exists, then you're going to have a long path for people to get to that value. It's going to be increasingly lengthy and difficult for them to go from that first-time experience to this fandom state. And as I mentioned earlier, that really starts to affect bottom line and growth of companies, which is what we ultimately care about. But it's not just the presence of app install banners and mistimed promotions that keeps people from getting to product value. It's the impressions and the mental model of a product that they build as they go from first experience onward. So to illustrate, I want to show this app we worked on at Google a couple of years ago called Spaces. And it starts pretty typically, right? Little start screen, what have you. And when we were building this application, we were running this process called write studies. So every week, we would work on the prototype, iterate on it, put it in a couple of people's hands. They'd use it for a week. We'd talk to them, see what we learned, debrief, and then repeat for the next week. And we did this for multiple weeks. And what we really quickly realized here when we watched people use this thing, we just thought they'd kind of like dismiss it. But we started to come up with an interesting metric, which was called TTTP, time to toilet paper. And that was how long it took people to fixate on the roll of toilet paper and be like, why is this toilet paper here? You guys have this toilet, was it toilet paper? Why is that here? People noticed this thing and just became fixated. Why? What does it mean? Why is there toilet paper there? Right? And so we didn't want people to get hung up on any one of these specific examples and what have you. So we thought, okay, well, why don't we just try showing people multiple ways that they can use this product, which is this sort of small group sharing app. So we tried to show people examples, but people still got hung up on them. What happened is the example that they first encountered set their mental model and told them whether or not the product was for them. So we would get comments like this, well, I don't really cook, so I don't think this is for me. Just boom, seeing that cake recipes, they're done. It's a cooking site. Or, oh, I already have a place to put my photos. Right? So the first thing that they get exposed to has this really disproportionate impact on how they think about it, which is, again, why it's so critical to get this first to fandom gap closed. Now, thankfully, we had a really insightful user experience researcher on this product, Max, and he started to notice something really interesting, what he started to notice as we were iterating on these first-time user experience flows is that people developed two distinct models of how this product worked. We were consistently asking people to describe what they thought the app was for, and he was going through those descriptions, and he was thinking about how to classify them, and he noticed a pattern. One set of people thought it was for private stuff, and they would use examples like, okay, well, I can make this small group to help people brainstorm and work on a project at school, like these private use cases. And other people had this public mental model of these shared places to talk. And they're like, oh, it's kind of like Pinterest and a blog, and people can browse it and like it. And then we noticed that majority of people had this public mental model, and a small percent of people thought it was for this private stuff. Right? So this is kind of interesting. People have two different worldviews of what the product's for. But what became really interesting is when we compared the results of how people valued the service against what mental model they had. And we saw that people that thought it was for private stuff thought it was way more useful, thought it was actually fun, they had an easier time using it, right? And across every metric, people with a private mental model valued the service so much more than people with this public set of use cases in mind. So we said, okay, well, we have to be much clearer to talk about what the two different use cases are, right? So we say there's public stuff and then there's private stuff that you can do on this product. Well, that really didn't help that much. So then we said, okay, well, we need to explain how the two are related. So we changed the intro and we said, you can use these public things to find stuff to put inside your private stuff. That didn't help too much either. So then we dropped all mentions of public stuff altogether. But when people went to go and create one of these spaces, right, they'd go and say, I'm going to make a space. We'd give them this option between private and public. And so then all the confusion flared up again at that point. So we said, okay, well, why don't we do this? Why don't we hide the option to make it public? And you can only get to it if you hit edit. Okay, that helped a little bit, but then people still found it. And they got confused. So then we kept tweaking things, and we kept trying to emphasize this private aspect, right? So we said, this is private. Only you can see it. We stuck little private icons. We're just being super obvious around the privateness and just integrating. Again, remember, right time and place to surface this information, integrating it into UI with the look and feel, all that good stuff I talked about. And through that, we were actually able to have a pretty steady impact on the percent of people that had a private mental model, right? They thought of it for these private use cases. And if you recall, the ones that have this private mental model are the ones who thought that it was the most useful. So all of this was a really good thing. But we only ever got to about 60% of people, which is why that was is because we never killed that public feature. It always somehow crept in and showed up somewhere. People always got to it. And the learning for me is what should we take away from all this, right? Like, one, this mental model that people get in their head early on is a pretty critical part of how they understand the value and the purpose of a product. These things get set really early on, and they are very hard to change, right? Whatever kind of things they encounter first already lock them into this mode of thinking about what you're doing. So we want to really be conscious about setting the right mental model. We want to make sure people run into the right stuff first. We want to make sure that we embrace people poking around and give them these nudges at the right time and place when they need them. But the one that we didn't do enough of was we want to remove stuff that gets in the way of that. Right? And if you think back to all the work we did on that Free People e-commerce site redesign, what did we do primarily? We mostly got rid of stuff. Right? We kind of got rid of a bunch of things, and we tried to make sure that what people encounter first, right, helps them understand what the product is for and how they'll use it. That's what we're trying to do. So we've talked about a lot of stuff now. I'm going to try and summarize things a little concisely. But when companies grow, decision-making moves further away from the customers because of all the different layers, and people start to do things for reasons other than the customer. So testing results made me do it. Other people are doing it. Legal made me do it. And what that starts to do is create this gap between what your product is and why it exists. And you can see some of these gaps, hopefully, in the examples that I've illustrated. And when there's this big gap between these things, it makes it really hard for people to come in and understand the value you provide them, to become fans, to become active users, right? All these things that we add to the quote-unquote user experience get in the way of people experiencing the value and purpose of what we're making. Not great, right? So how do we improve this situation? How can we bridge these gaps and really become more user-centric instead of just saying we are? As I showed earlier, all those job descriptions say user-centric. Then you go to the product, you're like, ugh. So we talked about 3 gaps. I'll give you 3 ways to close them. And since all these gaps are related, as I just showed you a second ago, these techniques apply to bridging all of them. The first thing that we can do is just be aware that these seams open up within our companies. Be aware when people are making decisions for reasons other than the customer. When people's justifications for stuff don't even mention anything about end users, right? They only refer to things like internal guidelines or requirements from isolated teams. These requirements are departmentalized. When people are making decisions and nobody's speaking up on behalf of the end user, it's usually a good sign that something's not working, right? And easy way to summarize this is knowing is half the battle. Does anybody get this reference? Wow, okay, G.I. Joe, it's okay. But awareness is the first step to improving the situation. Next, metrics. People often ask me, what do I do at Google? Believe it or not, it has nothing to do with mobile design. I work on company-wide metrics and data and analysis. Why? Because I have this fundamental belief that you are what you measure, right? So spending the time to get the right metrics affects so many things downstream. Let me give you an example. Let's say you set a metric in your company for newsletter signups, right? We want to increase the amount of people who sign up for our newsletter. So you start out, okay, let's put a little sign up for our daily newsletter thing here. But it's not growing fast enough. Got to get that metric up. So we make it bigger. And then we make it bigger. And then before you know it, your whole experience is sign up for the newsletter. You have become what you measure. Still don't believe me? How about let's set one like app downloads. Again, start small. There's a little use the app download prompt, right? Well, you know, that's not, it's good, but it's not performing as well. Ooh, if we make a bigger one, it performs better. Open an app, insert it in the middle of content. Well, that gets more clicks. So, okay, but still, we need more. So what if we put one kind of at the bottom of the page and make it sticky? Because this one's, you can scroll that one away, but this one is sort of locked in. So it won't go away no matter how much people try to actually see the content. We'll lock that in. Ooh, that's performing better. Now, what if we make it bigger? Block more of the content and keep people in. Oh, you know what? That's working well. So, okay, now why do we do this? And pretty soon you're a giant app install ad. You have become what you measure. And you see this time and time again, right? So I can't stress the importance enough of spending the time to get the metrics right, right? And usually this boils down to one simple thing: long-term and user-centric metrics versus short-term operational and or transactional metrics. You probably want to optimize on the first one more than anything else. And people often ask me, well, how do I decide what to measure? I have a very simple way of doing this. It can get more complicated, but basically, like, what do you want to see happen? Right? And if you say newsletter signups and you set that metric, well, you'll get that. So think about how you can actually measure that. Could be data you have, could be data you have. But then think about what would happen if you start measuring that. So we want to grow newsletter signups. Well, what will happen if we start measuring newsletter signups? Oh, wait, we might end up with our website just becoming a giant newsletter sign-up form. That's not good, right? What you really want is something that incents the right actions. And then once you have this list of metrics and you know what kind of impact measuring it could have, you can rank those based on the ones that have the clearest impact on your goals. And again, hopefully your goals are long-term and user-centric. Right? Then I strongly suggest actually collecting some data for the top few and testing this out, just like you would test out anything else. See what kind of outcomes happen. Are they the ones you wanted? Are they not the ones you wanted? And the ones that actually do lead to the outcomes you want, that's the ones you should regularly and visibly track. So it seems involved, seems a little complicated versus just picking a number. Yes, should be. Right? This can really, really change what we do, and very quickly too. Finally, and most importantly, spend time with customers. And I want to come back to this Airbnb story that I started the talk off with. Back in 2009, Airbnb wasn't growing at all. And so at the behest of one of their investors, Paul Graham, Joe and Brian went to New York because they had a bunch of people there that had listed their apartments and weren't necessarily getting conversion. So they went and stayed with 24 hosts in New York. And what they realized was the people's places were so much nicer than the photos they had posted on Airbnb. The photos were like really crappy camera phone things, and they just looked bad. So they're like, oh, we can fix this. They went and rented a $5,000 camera. They took a bunch of pictures of the places. They posted them on the site. And the next week, revenue in New York doubled. Because the site, the listings that had these great pictures got 2 to 3 more bookings. And from that point on, every week after, revenue on Airbnb doubled. And I'm going to quote Joe directly. We used to travel and stay with our customers. It was the ultimate enlightened empathy. You were so close to the people you were designing for that it informed you in a way that other stuff couldn't. And you may say, well, that's not scalable. But that insight that they had, based on this success, here was kind of like what they looked like for the first couple years. Based on that success, they built and scaled a photography program where photographers would come to people's places and take their pictures, and boom, they were off to the races. One last quote from Joe, where he basically attributes all of this to being close to customers. And if you come back to how we started this presentation, it's the same experience he had at RISD with design critiques and his first company, where he was selling the cushions for your butt. Like getting as close as you can to the problem helps inform how to solve for it. But it's not just startup companies that can do this sort of stuff. When I was at eBay back in 2004, we had this program called Visits. And we would take product managers, execs, engineers into people's homes selling on eBay, sit down and check out their environment, see what they were doing. And you can see kind of like how people react to that. And these aren't crazy ideas, right? These programs exist. What happens is we get caught up in everything else we do all day. We get caught up in the organization and the workload and the meetings and all this, and we don't have time to make for our customers. We don't have time to go and spend with them, right? To see firsthand the gaps that exist. You heard from Jens at the beginning how they did that with Google Maps, right? Took people out into the field. So rare that that happens these days, but it's critical. So there's other ways to bring user voice into your organization. We have a whole talk talking about them. There's tons of resources out there. I don't think any of them are necessarily so much better or so much worse than the others. But like, just look for opportunities to do this. At Google, I organized this meeting called What Did We Learn This Week? And every single Friday at 9 a.m., I had leads from engineering, from product management, from UX, across the 10 different products that we're responsible for, and had people come in and talk about what they learned that week from either quantitative or qualitative results. Right? And this quickly became everybody's favorite meeting. As you can see how they're all so happy, right? But it was their favorite meeting because they got to actually like hear what people were doing with the things they worked on all day. Right? It was that direct connection, creating that path between how all the things they do all day, all the typing and everything actually translates to something in the real world. So there's no substitute for spending time with customers. Do it regularly, do it often. If the words user research or usability or whatever scare you, don't call it that. Just call it spending time with customers. Right? And that's really what it boils down to, just staying close to the people using your product, making sure your team stays close to them as much as possible, and making more time for that than you currently do, because I guarantee all of us could be making more time for that than we currently do. Because it's only through this direct empathy, only through seeing the world through our customers' eyes, that can we make good on this planet scale opportunity that we have with mobile, right? There's 4 billion networked, pocket-sized computers that are online and able to access the experiences we make for them. Let's make them the kind of experiences we want to have, and we want our friends and family to have, right? These seams we talked about can open up pretty quickly. So we need to be pretty vigilant. When companies grow, decision-making moves further away from customers. People do things for reasons other than the customer, and there's this gap between people's use of the product and getting to the value and the fandom that we actually want them to make. There's very simple techniques, I contend, for closing these gaps. One is just awareness, knowing what's happening. 2 is taking the time to set the right measures, ensure we get the kind of outcomes that we want. And 3 is just spending time with customers. These are pretty basic. But with these basic principles, we can make a better web for everyone and still have successful businesses, as I've hopefully illustrated. Right? I've shown several examples, if not many examples, of how doing the right thing for the customer ultimately does the right thing for the business. So please help me make this happen, if not for your customer's sake, then for your own sake, so you can actually use the web and internet again without being deluged by hostile user experiences. Please? Thanks.